All right. Good afternoon, everybody. To SEVA VentRounds. Today, we're going to be exploring two targeting schemes, dual and adaptive. These are images from our own ICU, and they're pretty fresh in general terms. So we're going to get started. So the disclosures, we discuss particulars of ventilator modes, no endorsement of any particular mode or manufacturer or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic's. There are my disclosures, and as well as Rob's in terms of mechanical ventilation and what we do. This is a recorded session, and so keep your microphones muted. I may call upon you as you comment on the chat box. That's a very good way to communicate. And then I may call on you to give your input or elaborate on some of your comments. And so for the Cleveland Clinic employees, there's CME, and there's going to be a QR code for all of you with a little code on how to get some CME. Very good. So let's start with this one. I posted this one on Twitter because I thought that was fantastic. Actually, it was near the end of the day. I was taking walking around the unit, and I saw this patient, and I thought that it was a fantastic image. I mean, this was by pure luck that occurs. Obviously, you don't expect the patient to do every single interaction possible on once in each one of the 4 breaths that the patient had. So I would ask, is there anybody that wants to give it a try at reading it in order, and then we'll dive into the targeting scheme. Again, this is a safe space. We're learning, and every time we learn a little bit more. Any of our fellows is interested in jumping on it? All right, Samir, go for it.
Eduardo, nice to see you after a little bit of a break I was on, and yeah, seems to be a great waveform. So beginning with the tag, it seems to be the control variable seems to be flow, so it's volume control, but it doesn't seem to be the good old CMB. I mean, there's these humps in the inspiratory flow that tell me that there's something going on there, and I think, and I'm not sure, that this might be one of those IMV dual changes. So I would say it's CVC IMV type 1 DD.
VC IMB
IMV
uh-huh
type 1, and it's DD.
Okay. All right. Very good. What is the load?
Looking at it, I think the load in inspiration seems to be a Pmus, at least 3 out of the 4 breaths, with this sort of hump, which I am seeing in the inspiratory flow, sort of showing that the patient's effort, and that would say it's mostly Pmus here. The 3rd breath doesn't seem to show that, but predominantly I would say Pmus. In the expiration phase, the decline is not very linear. It's not smooth, and at least 2nd and 3rd breath, I can for surely say that there's some sort of Pmus where there is this positive deflection that would explain patient effort. So Pmus predominantly would be my expiratory load. In terms of PV discordance, the trigger, for the first breath, I'm not really sure what's happening right before inspiration, but because there's color change in the first 3 breaths, I would say that at least the trigger is being detected. The pressure waveform is not really clear about things. So I would say the trigger is normal. Maybe the 4th breath, I'm not sure if that would be, you can say that reverse triggering is happening in the third and fourth breath, where there is a mandatory breath followed by a machine triggered breath, or an early trigger is happening. I'm not sure what's really happening there in the between the third and the fourth breath, because that seems to be that there is a trigger that somehow the machine detected effort, but after that a machine triggered breath that is cycled by the patient is happening. So I would say it's normal. Inspiration, I would say there is work shifting in inspiration. I wouldn't say there is extreme work shifting, but there is some work shifting in inspiration for sure, with that hump coming in, and maybe the algorithm in the machine is making it change to a different mode. Cycling, I think it's appropriately cycled for the most part. I don't see any cycling errors here. And in expiration, I would say there's expiratory work happening, because there's some positive deflections in at least the second and the third breath, that they're not like very linear in their decay. So I would say work shifting and expiration as well.
Okay. Thank you, Samir. Appreciate it. Um, any other comments? You're good? All right.
Yeah, I think I'm good. I'm not sure how I can explain the third to fourth transition. I'm not sure what's really happening, but I'm really interested to know.
All righty. So indeed, I mean, you can see, and that's why I leave the commercial name up here. It reads volume control. And so the tag is actually volume control. You're absolutely right there, and I agree with you. This is IMB, and actually, this is there's a little bit of every single type of breath, and I'll show it now. But this is IMB, although every single breath that you see here is mandatory. And so let me just elaborate on this. This is patient triggered, patient triggered, patient triggered, and this is machine triggered, right? There's no change in color. It just went through on its own. Sorry for that. This is machine cycled. This is machine cycled. This is machine cycled. And this actually is likely a patient or flow cycled, because and we're gonna go, but it was started by a mandatory breath, and so under these circumstances, all of these are, because you're controlling either the trigger or the cycle. These are all mandatory breaths. However, there's a condition in which if the patient, if this had been patient triggered, if this had been patient triggered, and this had been is patient cycle, this would become a spontaneous breath. That's the circumstances under which this becomes IMB. And so the type, as Mohammed Megri wrote, is a type 4. And the type 4 is it's particular only actually to this mode of mechanical ventilation, in which if the patient's inspiratory time cycles by the patient, and it was triggered by the patient, it's that single breath becomes spontaneous, and that's why it just happens on this mode of mechanical ventilation. So it's DD means for dual. And so let's talk a little bit about that dual behavior. Dual means that you switch from volume control to pressure control during inspiration. So as you very appropriately recognized, Samir, it goes from volume control, the flow is well controlled, to pressure control right here during the breath. That is in this algorithm, in this implementation of dual control. And I have to be very clear about that, because there's also other dual modes in which actually changes from PC to volume control, so in this one it changes because of Pmus, because the patient does effort. But in other modes, it may change from volume control and pressure control when you reach a Pmax limit set by the ventilator or by the clinician, and it says, oh, it reached high pressure, and so we're going to change to pressure control. And there's other modes in which it may actually change from pressure control to volume control, in which if the tidal volume had not been reached by a certain inspiratory time, it may change to volume control. And so I'll put that there just so that it's clear that this is a dual targeting scheme, but it's not the only one available in the universe. It's as it's implemented in this mode of mechanical ventilation. Rob, are you on the line?
Yes, sir.
Oh, perfect. Please, any comments here?
I was just referring to some of the chats.
Okay.
But yeah, this is a nearly perfect screenshot. If we only had a spontaneous breath in there, that would be perfect, wouldn't it?
Yes, I know. I was so excited.
Yeah, that's great. Samid asked, it's hard to tell if it's IMV type 1 or type 4, and I told him you can't tell by looking at this particular screenshot. You just have to know that dual targeting on the servo will give you, in some cases, a spontaneous breath. So that last breath, number 4, if that had been patient triggered, it would have been a spontaneous breath because it is clearly flow cycled because the inspiratory time is much longer. Well, it's noticeably longer, right?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you, Rob.
Surely.
I do think, Samit, you read this very nicely. There's Pmus during inspiration in all of these breaths, except on this one over here, on the third one, and or not major Pmus. And so when I read this, the first thing that I see is that the initial hike on pressure is not elevated. It's actually pretty mild. So it tells me that the majority of the load based on the slope is most likely elastic. But you could argue with me as well, Eduardo, are you sure there's not a little bit of Pmus at the beginning? But it looks, just by the way that it's following, and I'll show you another one, that this is most likely elastic load rather than resistive. During expiration, I'm fully in agreement with you. Instead of having the nice exponential decay, you have this effort throughout. So let's just dive into the trigger, and then we'll come back to or actually, let's go back to the dual. So in this type of dual, you will see, take a look at the inspiratory time here. All right, this is the inspiratory time here, the inspiratory time here, and the inspiratory time here. So you can see that this one is probably, this is the set inspiratory time. That's the normal. This is pretty close to the set, so I would say it's probably equal to the set inspiratory time. This one is shorter, and this one is longer. And the rationale that for that is that when you have a set inspiratory time like here, and a given flow, you're going to deliver the tidal volume that the machine wanted, and everybody's going to be happy and applauding. Yay! In this one over here, actually, it's probably a little bit shorter, closer to it, but because there is this changing flow, because the patient got a little bit more breath, actually, you can notice back here that this is the tidal volume that has been set. So the machine does is shortens the inspiratory time. It shortens it. And you can see actually that the area under the curve here is this size, so it shortens it a little bit to maintain the tidal volume at the same goal. But in this one, it's much bigger. So it shortens the inspiratory time even more to keep the tidal volume within range. So the engineers here were really thinking about how to keep the tidal volume at range. However, on the fourth breath, the patient has this early trigger, as Samit recognized it. So this is a machine trigger, and then there's Pmus, and the patient actually generates all this extra flow, and you can see how the tidal volume went above what was set. And so the machine, it's going to let the patient take the breath, and then it will cycle it when it reaches the predetermined flow and it cycles off the breath, but it cannot control that extra breath. So if the patient does more Pmus either at the end of the breath or a lot of Pmus at the beginning, and it may get larger tidal volumes, but this is a intelligent way of the engineers to trying to decrease the extra tidal volume for these patients and to minimize at the same time the amount of work shifting whenever there is Pmus active. And this was highlighted on this is the table. Don't look at this one for now, but just look at this one over here. And so you can see here the I time, and then the I time how it shortens, right? When there's more Pmus, and then when the Pmus is even larger, it shortens the I time. But if you start at the end and it's very large, it will cycle by the patient. Questions, comments, Rob?
No, that's a great summary. I just wrote in the chat that in this situation, the ventilator is sacrificing the goal of safety for the goal of comfort. So it basically, the engineers took the decision out of your hands.
Yeah, and you may, this is one of those in which you, this is why I put this waveform here, because you may walk by and look at this patient, and this is the same patient, exactly the same. And for most of the breaths, there is work shifting, so there's a degree. So you may, sorry, this is terrible drawing, but imagine a straight line there. So all of this area is the work shifting that it's occurring from here to here. All of this is work shifting. But by doing this, it avoided probably the pressure to go below baseline on this patient. And so you may walk by this patient and say, it's having some work shifting, but it's not terrible. And this may be completely acceptable for the patient. However, he may be waking up just like you saw over here. And this is a way that you add a little extra layer of saying, okay, I'm still focusing on safety, but if the patient does too much effort, I don't want him to or her to have a work shifting, and so they increase so you activate this, so it activates that. So Steve, you asked me about how to set it, so I knew that this was coming. So when you're in volume control, so this is the patient, you can see the oxygen concentration, PEEP, respiratory rate, tidal volume, flow pattern, which essentially 100 is a square, and if you put 0 here, it would be a triangle like that. And then there's this button that says flow adaptation. If you click it, you can see this little dotted line on top that activates the dual control. Nothing will tell you on the screen that this has been activated unless you open and you go all the way in here. Now, in some of our ventilators in the ICU, this button is disabled. It can be activated if you go into the settings for the machine, but for whatever reason, in many of them, it's disabled, and so forth.
That's on a Servo U, right?
That's a Servo U. That's correct.
You will find Servo I's with upgraded software that actually have 3 little buttons on them.
That's correct. And the one that looks like this one is dual.
Right. And the other interesting thing is in the manual of the page that you showed there, it never tells you how much flow the ventilator wants to give. And it turns out, and you can see from this waveform, it gives enough flow so that you at least reach baseline pressure.
Oh, that's a good point. I like that. So to avoid work shifting.
Correct. Yeah.
Very
Flow
good.
starvation.
So we have gone deep into a dual, but and talked a little bit about how it serves the goal of comfort. And so you may have a mode in which you're aiming at safety, and you can see that this patient was on a pretty high PEEP. But the goal is actually, but it has a hint of comfort there, of preventing work shifting and allowing the patient to have breathing on their own. which may be completely okay. You just have to be aware that the patient may, in occasions or consistently, have larger tidal volumes, as you can see over here, the tip right there. In terms of your read of the trigger, I agree 100% with you. This is normal trigger 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, and 3 are patient-triggered breaths. And actually, you can see the difference of amount of Pmus here. And this is a good representation of the amount of Pmus. Let me erase this. Oh, what did I do? Sabotage. Oh, that was not what I wanted to do. Escape there. So the size of essentially this pressure or the flow elevation is proportional in a way to the amount of Pmus that the patient is generating. So you can see here that the patient triggered and this amount of Pmus was the size of this flow, and over here it did much more Pmus and it drops the pressure even more on the flow. And in this one, it still triggers the ventilator, but it barely deforms the pressure waveform. But all of them are normal except the last one, which is, as we said, mandatory followed by patient. It's an early trigger. And as we had said before, that doesn't mean reverse trigger. It just means that the machine triggered earlier than the patient. And there may be multiple reasons for that. Work shifting, we agree. We have talked about work shifting and how it's not severe because it really, I mean, it passes a little bit the baseline, but it's not major. Cycle is normal. I agree with you. I mean, even though you could technically say that this is a late cycle, there is no evidence of pressure hike afterwards as if the patient was actively going there. It seems that he starts exhaling over here, but there may be still Pmus and we cannot see it because the flow is appropriate for this patient. And then finally, expiratory work, we talked about that. Rob, any comments here?
Nope, you covered it.
Fabulously. So really interesting and a good example of dual targeting and perhaps how you would be able. Any questions, comments? Okay. All right, so it's time to switch to another targeting scheme. This will become obvious as we go through it, and I put a couple of examples here, but there is some, again, nuances, and remember about these nuances between ventilators. So this doesn't mean that every ventilator has that. So anybody wants to read this one? I had seen somebody had asked to do that before. Oh, Mohammed, do you want to read this? It seems that you put your hat in you put your hat in. Are you up for it?
You talking about me or another Mohammed?
Yes.
Mohammed Megri?
No, you.
Yes. So yeah, sure. I can try. So so we'll start with the tag. It looks like a pressure control PC, and it's CMV, and I'll go with CMV. It's adaptive. CMVA, yes. And why I said that, like looking at the flow, so the flow is not fixed, and looking at most of the breaths were not triggered by the patient except for the second breath that was triggered by the patient. And if you see, like, the volumes has been like increasing steadily from the first breath. So I don't know if the machine that was trying to see after the patient got the effort, trying to see what's like the effort, the support that the machine need to give to reach the tidal volume that was set by the operator. But going to the load, I don't see any Pmus But I would like to say resistance. And even in the expiratory, like looking at it, like on my screen in here, everything is going back to the baseline and to the zero flow, and there's no any signs of Pmus during expiratory, and it's I'll go with elasticity for like elastic expiratory load. Trigger wise, I don't know if the first one, like it looks like there's a failed trigger before the first breath. Yes. And I don't see any other trigger abnormalities or desynchronies. There's no inspiration is normal. I don't see any work shifting. And cycle wise, I wouldn't say any change. Like I will say normal. I don't see any. Let me confirm. Yeah, I don't see any changes in cycle. The thing, if you look at it, like the breath that was triggered by the patient has like shorter inspiratory time, the second breath, comparing to the other breaths that was triggered by the machine. But I don't see any signs of like, even when the patient got the shorter breath, like there's no any signs of like the patient need more time or anything like that. Even for the one that was triggered by the machine, the patient didn't show any changes during that breath to see like maybe start breathing or anything. Like I don't see any, it doesn't go back to zero, the flow. It cut like maybe like that was set like 75% or something like that. But in expiration, I will say it's a normal, there's no any expiratory work as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed.
Oh, like if you go, can I add something? If you go to the one that the second breath, like if you see there's like, I don't know if that was set by the machine, like there's a little bit pause, like there's the zero flow at the end of the second breath, the one that was triggered by, yes, that's right. So I don't know, like if that's the patient that was, he got enough like flow and that's was like a zero flow because of they set the pause time, or it was like just the patient is done with his breathing. And thank you, sorry.
No problem. All righty. So let's get started. So pressure control, we agree with that definitely. I mean, there's not one of these flows has been controlled by anything. So this is, the pressure is being controlled. Mandatory breaths, yes. I mean, this is triggered by the machine, so that's a mandatory breath. And actually, this pause that you highlight here, Mohammed, means it's a telltale sign that this is cycled by the machine. So that means that this is being cycled by the machine. So this becomes a mandatory breath. So every single one of these breaths, because this is mandatory, are mandatory. So every breath that you see on this sequence is CMB. So it's mandatory. So it's a continuous mandatory ventilation. The targeting scheme, if you saw this one on its own, it may be a little bit challenging to read and to think that this is adaptive. We know that it's adaptive because it says PRVC, but there's a clue here that it's something that drives me a little bit nuts on the implementation of this algorithm on this ventilator. What you see here is, and I'm gonna consider the set inspiratory pressure probably around here in this. So if I draw a line, I'm being as straight as I can, you can see that the breaths that are mandatory received or that were triggered by the machine received a set amount of pressure, and they are reaching their target tidal volume. So it's 430 in average. They're getting about the target that they want for the patient. However, there is this patient trigger breath, and you recognize it not only by the deep inspiratory pressure, but also by the changing color that we have right here, and it tells us that it's a flow triggered breath. But you will recognize that actually the pressure is a little bit higher than the pressure that the prior breath, without any good reason. I mean, the last breath was not, the tidal volume was not below target. It just simply, this breath that was triggered by the patient gets a higher pressure than the prior one. And I don't know how many of you have seen this, but I put another example here in which it's again a PRBC patient. And you have here two situations, and this is a classic early trigger situation in which you have the mandatory breath. It's triggered here, and it goes to a certain pressure. And then the spontaneous breath that the machine reads as the patient is triggering it. It's still a mandatory breath because it's cycled by the machine. Now, even though the patient is doing effort, the machine now delivers a larger amount of pressure. This is much more evident here, but you can see it on the prior breath, the same thing, and the amount of pressure that it delivered was at the same level. I mean, it goes up because now the patient is doing effort to exhale. Well, thank you, man. Yes, I see it only on the Servo U. I have not seen it on other ventilator doing this, but that's correct. This is a part of their algorithm that achieves this, and I presume that they have a set pressure that you use for that it calculates at some point for patient triggered breaths, and there's a pressure that it triggers for the mandatory breaths or something along those lines, because it's not on the manual. Rob, any comments here?
No, I have no idea why it's doing that, and we might be able to reverse engineer it in the sim lab, but it would take a little bit of work. Next
Yeah,
time we're on the line with the engineers, we should get them to tell us this.
right. So a little bit. This is something that it's a nuance of the mode, but you can see it happening here. It's the exact same behavior for these patients, and you can see that it just increases the pressure even though there's effort. So there's no it should be exactly the same amount of pressure than the prior breath, not higher. Alrighty, so that's adaptive, the adaptive targeting. Just for those that want a refresher on adaptive, just remember, adaptive means that you set a target. So instead here, this would be better if it said the word target, tidal volume, and every time you achieve the target tidal volume. So I'm gonna just put a line here to highlight that, right? So if it's touching or around a certain perimeter of that target tidal volume, average tidal volume, the ventilator is gonna be happy. You're gonna be happy, and it's gonna keep the pressure the same. But if the tidal volume is below, the ventilator is gonna say, oh, that's not good, sad face, and it's gonna increase the pressure to achieve the tidal volume that you want. If the tidal volume is above what you about in the last breath is above the tidal volume that you wanted, then the next breath is gonna the ventilator is gonna be sad because the tidal volume is high, and so the next breath it's gonna drop the pressure. And so it always happens after the last breath, the exhale tidal volume says, okay, we are at target or not at target, and boom, it will change it, or inspiratory tidal volume. Every ventilator has a different algorithm. And some of them you may be able to set how much they can drop, the lowest limit of dropping the pressure. But in others, just as in this one, it can go all the way down to 0. So this is a good example of that, in which it goes down to 0, but we're going to read that in a second. All righty. Questions about adaptive?
Another point about what you said about the target tidal volume.
Mm-hmm.
Some ventilators target the exhaled tidal volume on the previous breath. Some target the inspired tidal volume, and others, like the Hamilton ventilators, average the two because they don't know what's the right number. And that has various implications. For example, if you have a huge leak out, an uncuffed endotracheal tube or a big leak through a bronchopleural cutaneous fistula. So those are all things to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that, Rob. And that's a key of knowing what your ventilator actually does. And sometimes it doesn't come on the manual as clear as you would want it to come.
Rob, do we know if our Servo U targets the inspiratory volume or the expiratory, the previous?
Expiratory.
Sorry, you said expiratory?
I believe that's true, yes.
Okay. I was just wondering maybe if it's inspiratory and usually maybe the added breaths like in the next example are too small, so it gives more pressure instantaneously to try and explain why the algorithm behaves the way it is.
You know what?
'Cause
You might be right. I have to think about that. I think it does target the inspiratory volume because it's going to be affected more by leaks in a bad way.
Yeah, but you can see
Yeah.
that in this one, for example, that's why I brought this one up. The tidal volume is way above the target for this patient. And so if that was the case, it should use even less pressure for the next one,
Yeah.
right? And it uses more.
Yeah, I checked this out in the lab a few years ago, but I just forgot which it is.
Come on, Rob. You have to remember everything.
I have to remember every little detail.
All righty. Ryan is asking us, do we want to aim for a more squared pressure waveform? So your question comes, should we use rapid rise time instead of a lower rise time? As you probably have heard us say, Ryan, we usually use the shortest rise time possible, so to minimize any work of breathing. Because if there's a pressure spike over here at any time, it really doesn't bother us because it doesn't reach the alveoli. It's all the resistive component. So my practice is to try to minimize the rise time or make it as short as possible. So reach some ventilators put it by time and some ventilators put it by percent. So I try to reach either 0 of time or 100% as fast as possible. Alrighty. So let's talk a little bit about the load. Mohammed talked about a component of resistive and elastic so different discrepant loads. Usually, the majority of the time, the load is concordant, meaning the elastic load and the resistive, if it's elastic during inspiration, it's going to be elastic during expiration. There's some conditions in which you can have that discordance, in which there is and usually it's a elastic during inspiration and then resistive during expiration. And we have seen that occur in, for example, patients that had problems with the expiratory filter and that it was clogged or the HME or whatnot. But so in general, you try to find them that they're concordant. And so let's talk a little bit about this because I had some trouble reading this, and I want to hear the thought process of the team. But you would agree with me that this does not decay exponentially, right? It actually this one perhaps a little bit, but it has a little bit of a Humpty Dumpty there. It's not the best, most beautiful decay that we have seen, and actually this is CMB, so we have different end expiratory flows for each one of them because what we said is the I time. So the inspiratory time is set by the ventilator, by us actually. We set the tidal volume and the inspiratory time, and the end expiratory flow is going to be dependent. End inspiratory flow is going to be dependent on the respiratory lung characteristics. So if the patient was paralyzed, every single one of these end inspiratory flows should be at the same height, right? Because nothing is changing. However, we see that this end expiratory flow is at this level, and this one is all the way down here. Rob, you want to comment on that?
That's a good observation because that's another indicator of Pmus, right? The higher the end inspiratory flow, the higher the Pmus must be, even though if you can't tell the difference in the humps in the flow, right?
Exactly.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
The
So
mireles index.
yeah. So this is one of those that, and especially with what you said, Mohammed, when you pointed out that there was this evidence of failed effort down here, and then I see different end inspiratory flows between these two. It makes me think if this patient is having actually a asynchrony, meaning he's having over here a failed trigger, and there's probably some Pmus occurring in here. So the patient is doing some effort right here, and perhaps some here. I'm not entirely. I was not entirely. This looks too similar to think about that. So perhaps there's an early trigger hidden here with this failed trigger, but there's some Pmus occurring in between these breaths. That was my interpretation of this. And I could not say that without either doing an end expiratory pause or touching the patient or putting an esophageal catheter or putting a EDI catheter. But this is highly suspicion for presence of Pmus in the background that we're not detecting. During inspiration, there's minimal work shifting as you indicated, so normal sounds perfect to me. And cycle, we talked about the only late cycle that exists is this one over here. Whenever you see this little pause, any pause that you see, that means that the ventilator is controlling it, so it's cycling it, and it tells you that this patient has a late cycle. Now, should you do anything with that? Probably not, because it seems that the rest are working appropriately. But it's something that if you're doing a trial and trying to figure out if there is what type of desynchrony there is and an index of it, you can see how much you can extract on one of these waveforms, just one single page. And then finally in expiration, I think that it's passive mostly. This one looks like a little bit of Pmus, but this one is passive, and that's why I'm gonna go back to this area over here. This one is a beautiful exponential decay. I mean, you can see how nice it goes out, and it takes around probably less than a second or a second, 1.1 seconds, which goes aligned with the presence of an elastic as you read it, which makes me think that you were seeing Pmus plus minus an elastic load there. All righty. Woo, that was a high quality one, huh? Questions, comments, Rob?
Nope, good.
Okay. All righty, team. Let's move on. This one, I just use it as an example for you to see. But I put this one, which is also an adaptive mode, but it's a little bit more cumbersome. And so anybody wants to read this one? Have no fear.
I can go for it. This here looks to be PC, and then I'm just gonna look at the cycling here to the side if I'm looking at, I mean the mode itself, I know it's an IMV, but these particular breaths that I'm seeing here seem to be more or less cycled by the machine. And then it's adaptive, and we're seeing it's an IMV type 3. And the whole idea is it shifts from what looks like to be pressure support, but it's actually volume support, where it's a PRVC to volume support. This is what it's shifting through. So PC IMV3 AA. What is the load? Inspiratory load is Pmus. and pretty consistent Pmus actually. I like the fact that the patient is very consistent, reliable, and predictive. And then looking at expiration, there is expiratory work as well. Now looking at trigger, the trigger seems to be appropriate. These are pressure triggered breaths, and there isn't delay. The flow starts right away. So I think it's normal trigger at this point. And then looking at inspiration, there is some work shifting. It doesn't go below the baseline, but there is a significant degree of work shifting there. And then in terms of cycle, so again, I think these are machine cycled. Now, looking at the pressure waveform, and you look at the end of the pressure waveform, and you wonder, but I think it's appropriately cycled. I think what we're seeing there is a manifestation of the pressure dropping initially due to the Pmus, and then the machine trying to catch up with the pressurization, and that's why we see that peak at the end. Now, expiration, again, as I said, there is some expiratory work. Now, looking at the volume waveform, there is that kind of sign of cutoff at the end of the volume. It doesn't go all the way to the baseline. And the differential here would be, it could be secondary to the Pmus and expiration versus maybe some like auto peak or some trapping. And the way that I would tell for sure would be to do an expiratory pause to try and delineate them. I don't think it's a leak. I mean, but it's also, yeah, so leak, auto peep, or the actual expiratory work could manifest in the same appearance.
Thank you, Ahmed. This is a very nice read. So some details on what you read. So let's just so it's pressure control, as you said, very well. I mean, even though the patient, actually, this is one of those things that maybe it's food for thought. In general, is the absence of variability of this patient, right? It's doing a lot of effort continuously, same almost identical tidal volume, breath per breath, with same waveform. So breathing relatively fast with inspiratory and expiratory effort. So when I see that, it just tells me what's going on here. I mean, what's the metabolic derangement or brain derangement that this patient has to be undergoing this. So it's in IMB. You're correct. Auto mode is an IMB targeting, and it switches between PRVC and volume support. And as you correctly alluded to, one is CMB A, and the other one is CSB A. So adaptive, both of them, but one is a spontaneous mode. And so let's talk a little bit about, you recognize that this is patient triggered. Each one of them is patient triggered, but you thought that this was mandatory. Can you tell me why you thought that?
Yeah, I think again, it has to do with, as you mentioned, I mean, that the length of the breath is pretty much the same with every single breath to start with. And then it's also, when you look at the size of the breaths, it's more or less the same. So yeah, I mean, in terms of pressure controlled mode, for the most part, I look at the inspiratory time. That's how I determine, because with the size of the breath or the volume can be variable. You actually expect it to be variable. But as you pointed, it's quite interesting that to the contrary here, it's not. But yeah, because the I time is equal in every breath, that's why I said it's machine cycled.
I love it. Yeah, very good observation, and that is a challenge, and that's why, in part, I put the whole screen so that you could read. So because it's telling us that it's volume support, this is actually cycled by the patient. It's just that his tonic, his variability is gone, and absence of variability is not a good thing in life, and so. But it would be hard otherwise without us putting the tag, the commercial name, and what actually in what part of the algorithm is the ventilator on. It's type 2. Type 3, the only mode that does type 3 right now is ASV and I think mandatory minute ventilation. And remember that type 3 means that the mandatory breaths and spontaneous breaths will coexist to keep at this point target thing. So as it's implemented right now, it's mandatory minute ventilation. So you want to maintain that minute ventilation, and so both of them will coexist to achieve that goal. If you can achieve it with just spontaneous breath, there will be no mandatory. In this case, it's a type 2, which means that the ventilator suppresses the mandatory breaths whenever it feels a spontaneous breath. All right, Rob, any other comments?
Just a nuance here is ventilators do it different ways, but the way that when we say that type 2 suppresses based on frequency, it's really based on the total cycle time, right? Because frequency is 1 over the total cycle time.
Yes.
So it looks at the expiratory time, adds it to the inspiratory time, and if that divided into 60 is greater than, the set frequency, that's how it works. So in other words, it doesn't count 60 spontaneous breaths or a whole minute worth of spontaneous breath before it starts, suppressing mandatory breaths.
Fabulous. Thank you, Rob.
Yep.
You're right, absolutely right with the Pmus everywhere. This is a pure Pmus. The patient is doing all the effort, and actually, this is where the adaptive is a challenge. You may argue, I could argue that it may be part of your goal. Maybe you were trying to win this patient, but this patient, if you see the baseline, the patient is getting essentially no support. And these hikes over here of pressure are actually a manifestation of the patient actively exhaling, going from inspiration, relaxing, and going to active exhalation. So this is actually not support. It's a manifestation of the ventilator cannot adapt as fast as it can. So the patient is doing everything. The trigger is definitely normal. There is significant work shifting. I mean, this patient is doing all the work of breathing, and the ventilator is just maintaining the pressure at the baseline. The cycle is normal. As I mentioned, this is an artifact, and then expiratory work. And there is a comment here that a man does, and I think that it's important for all of us to recognize, is when you see the square root sign over here, this thing over here, and it's a constant. Every breath, the patient has that. The patient would be dead after 10 of these breaths because the lung would be exploding. So if it's constant, the discrepancy is likely due to a leak or a dysfunctional sensor or a miscalculation on the ventilator. So whenever you see this persistently, that's not auto-peep. You may see the auto-peep intermittently as you start auto-peeping, but then you eventually will reach a how do you say this?
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium. Thank you, Rob.
Yep.
And
I don't know how to say
disappear.
it in Spanish.
I was trying to say it in Spanish. Next time I will say equilibrium. Very good. So any other questions, comments?
One comment is, clinically, this patient is basically on CPAP. My guess is that after a while, he would just get tired and the mandatory breaths would come back in. But if you didn't want that to happen, you could still use auto mode, but you just use pressure control to pressure support.
Exactly. Absolutely. So here the key question is, what's your goal?
Right.
If the goal is safety, at least the patient is achieving the lung protective tidal volume, as you can see over here. So you may be happy about that. If the goal is comfort, well, in comfort, the patient it's synchronous. I'm not going to say it's not there's synchrony, but the work of breathing is completely towards the patient and not towards the machine. And if your goal is liberation, meaning automatic decrease in pressure, then it has achieved it, right? It has decreased the pressure so as to free this patient out to the world. So it all depends how you see this. If the goal is safety, if the goal is comfort, and the goal is liberation, and it may be that he may be achieving the tidal volume, but you're looking at him and saying, well, the work of breathing is dismal. I mean, it's horrendous, and you may not want that to be occurring, especially in somebody with very high PEEP, or not very high, but high PEEP, and still with oxygen requirements that are elevated. So I will put it there for you to think about this as you're coming to the bedside and reading these waveforms. It all depends what's your goal: safety, comfort, or liberation. Here's the code for your CMEs. And finally, just send us your waveforms. Send it to me. That's my email. There's a Twitter handle. We're happy to read anything that you send us. Thank you very much, and great job, Ahmed, Mohammed, and Samir. Really, really good discussion. Thank you, Rob. Have a great day.